My talk will be about my recent book, which is about style. It will be about why style should matter, how it can matter, how we should define it so that it would matter, and how we should think about it as a shared architectural concept. And of course, because of what style implies, which is about the process of shaping architecture, I will use a few projects of the office to illustrate it. So that's a kind of an overview of my lecture. So the function of style. Now, before talking about the function of style, let me just say that by function, I mean agency rather than utility. And I think that's quite important to remember. So when we consider the function of style, we are asking what is the agency of style of buildings as objects in everyday life. Now, the relationship between people and objects in everyday life has been discussed in the field of phenomenology. For instance, how people gain access to the beings of objects. But objects, from the point of phenomenology, are not usually considered to have agency, just this pre-existing being that they're composed of, such as natural laws that they're governed by, or their metaphysical origins, such as God, and so forth. Now, recent investigations that extend the field of phenomenology, such as, for example, speculative realism, do extend this and question the flattening of objects and subject, but they still consider objects as given and without agency or function of their own. Now, we know that buildings as objects in everyday life don't just exist by themselves as ready-made objects. They are arranged through the architectural process, and this process of arranging buildings is what determines their style, and this is why I think style is so central in the discussion of agency of buildings in everyday life. Now, traditionally, style has been the word employed to describe a single narrative around which architects unite buildings. But if this is the case, we might say that contemporary architecture, as you see suggested by this series of images, has no style, because it is hard to identify any unifying narrative in this kind of built environment that we are witnessing, which is characterized by immense diversity. Indeed, some people do say that there is no style in contemporary architecture, and hence there have been a few cases of grand new narratives of trying to remedy this architecture's lack of apparent style, and to propose a new unifying, let's say, style. But is this really, and this is my question, is this really no style? Is it just a product of eclecticism or architecture's response simply to the market? Or is it the problem that our current definition of style can simply not explain what is underlying contemporary architecture? And I would say this is the case. Now, since the 1990s, three pivotal changes in the way buildings are shaped and as well as experienced force us to really question our existing definition of style. Firstly, buildings today face many challenges that are separate, distinct, and irreconcilable. They have led to different coefficients for buildings, such as space planning, security, rights of light, fire, engineering, sustainability engineering, facade engineering, health and safety, the list just goes on, that are often beyond the expertise of the architect, requiring specialist consultants. This means that the design process has changed from a solo activity of just the architect to more of a team sport, in which the different coefficients are the product of separate and concurrent lines of inquiry that happen at different speeds during the design process, and introduce much unpredictability to it. So different building elements as a consequence of this, no matter how small or large, are vital forces for the projects, and some crossing paths with one another and others not. And therefore, any unifying narrative obviously constrains the dynamics or the possibilities of these different forces that are at play in any one project. Secondly, with the advent of the internet, the way architectural ideas is made is also different, since ideas are now shared and circulated worldwide with astonishing speed, apprehended sometimes often unconsciously. And architects are therefore so steeped in each other's ideas and theoretical anxieties that the certainty of what belongs to one person and what to another has disintegrated. And thirdly, again, because of the internet, the way buildings are experienced has changed, since many of the everyday activities that we used to go to buildings to participate in now happen online, such as reading a book, watching a match, or shopping, for example, and they are far more easily accessed online, which means that since these online activities are reduced to the uniform context of the screen, independent of time and space, their experience has actually become quite similar, whether you are shopping or reading different kinds of books or buying an item of clothing. Now, to complement the uniformity and the ubiquity, you could say the comfort, the ease with which these everyday activities can be found, or we can interact with them online, buildings have actually started to exploit their unique spatio-temporal nature, which has, of course, been the absolute fundamental core of buildings, but I would like to argue that this aspect of buildings has become far more important the more our life has become digital. For example, libraries in the wake of e-books. So the old 20th century is on the left, and perhaps the contemporary situation is the type of it is on the right each time. Libraries in the wake of e-books have changed from being inward-looking book repositories simply for taking out a book and consuming it, to open and differentiated spaces that encourage people to construct different reading and learning habits and new forms of communication. While schools, for example, the old school on the left, that used to be generic, tutor-focused, one-way looking classrooms, perhaps the format that we have right now here, which is about the transmission and reception of knowledge to unique differentiated configurations that encourage different kinds of experience-based learning. Department stores responding to e-tailing, to the rise of e-tailing, have shifted from hermetic environments whose sole objective is the provision of goods to places in which the experience of shopping is site-specific, so that buying an item in one store is not like any other. While offices, rather than declining in the face of email and conference calling, have changed from one-size-fits-all arrangement to create efficiency in the workplace, to different types of interstitial spaces that promote knowledge construction through chance encounters and serendipitous knowledge exchange. Therefore, the agency of buildings today, or their ability to act, resides in their actual presence. And how that actual presence informs people's experience of their everyday activities, and thereby makes a contribution, a creative contribution to their everyday life. To think of style in relationship to people's everyday life encounters with a building, rather than understanding the narrative underlying it, is to deviate it from the traditional uses of style, to unite buildings, to represent, for example, the personality of its architect or author. Rafael Moneo, for example, has written about strategies, by which he means mechanisms, procedures, or paradigms, and formal devices that recur in the work of architects and define their personal domain. Now, this, I believe, is an old definition of style. Or to use style to unite buildings to represent their geographical location, as suggested by these images or these roads. For example, Bannister Fletcher proposed that the evolution of architecture was influenced by diverse factors that ultimately were rooted in nationality, or to use style to unite buildings to represent the time it belongs to, which various historians, Riegel, Wolflin, Henry Russell's Hitchcock described as Kunstwollen, or the artistic impulse of a race, nation, or age. Alternative to these ways of representing a kind of a narrative to unify groups of buildings has been a kind of a narrative that unites different elements within a single building to represent a kind of organicism, an organic whole. Viollet-le-Duc, Botticher, functionalism, Frank Lloyd Wright were proponents of this idea of style. Now, we need to question whether these uses of style are not redundant today, following the processes or the conditions that I mentioned earlier. For example, should style strive for unity? No, unity across a group of buildings implies that the actual presence of a building or the individual parts of them plays no part in people's experience of their everyday life, and rather provides it with the same experience as all other buildings. As you see, the buildings are all the same. While trying to formally unite all elements of a building compromises the ability to simultaneously address different, distinct and separate concerns that, again, I mentioned buildings are now subject to. To engage the different elements as different vital forces for or agents, style needs to account not their ability to produce unity, but multiplicity. In other words, for how the elements of a single building can be formally equal and yet enmeshed so that they would together produce new possibilities. Now, should style represent authorship? No, today architectural ideas exist as an open source. As again I mentioned earlier, the overzealous protection of an architect's ideas as a signature or autonomous domain inhibits the migration and circulation of ideas and the generation of new ones, rethinking what is commonly labeled as copying or imitation as sharing from a common pool, as happens, for example, in the field of music. This is different music genre, or let's say styles within a certain genre related, being in a way families of each other. It will allow us to detach the approaching style in architecture similar to this, as a rhythm, if you like, will allow us to detach it from any single architect and allow it to be appropriated by architects and to be changed to produce new styles by different architects. Now, should style represent nationality? No, because in today's world of extensive free trade, the mobility of capital, the rise of transnational corporations, let alone the increased mobility of technologies, materials, and designers, strict boundaries between nations have actually been eroded. Like the style of the modern bicycle that has evolved in the hands of different nations. Ever since its inception, we need to approach style of buildings also through this idea of singularity. That style can be adopted by any nation and changed to produce new unpredictable styles. Should style represent the period of time? No, because time is not divided into periods within which everything is fixed or frozen. Today, as I mentioned earlier, buildings are subject to different external and often conflictual causes, which means that they evolve through separate, concurrent lines of development that unfold at different speeds throughout the design process, which may take anything, let's say, between 1, 6, or even 10 years, an architectural project. Enhanced levels of security may require imminent changes to the entry sequence of a building, let's say, earlier on in the design process. Whereas new environmental regulations may not suddenly necessitate changes to the envelope design of a building midway through the process. The selection of a new mayor every 4 years, say if you are in France, I don't know how often it happens here, could imply change in the space program or even the building location. So the organicist model in which each element or part must obediently serve the whole in a vacuum is clearly out. Like the M16 rifle, the the challenge, suggested by the changes kind of over time, the challenge for an architect today is to conceive of buildings not as unified wholes, but as a confederation of elements, which we can call an assemblage or manifold, with a particular kind of arrangement or grouping that introduces an effectivity proper to them without restricting their independence, so that they can be changed over time during the design process. Now, having discarded the representational narratives that usually, traditionally have defined style, what remains in people's experience of buildings is their raw presence or their thisness, which their individual elements together with their colors, textures, shapes, and forms together produce. These may seem limitations, but in fact for the architect, they hold a secret to a new way of working, in which the ever-increasing number of elements that buildings are divided into can be assembled together without the constraints of representation. Now, freedom from representation rather than a building's elements or parts being combined into a unified whole means that they can have their own internal disciplines, so that their combined assemblage produces a coherent as well as a complex rather than unified whole. Now, in this new way of working, individual elements or parts have a distinct propensity, which manifests itself as a cluster of affects. Now, affect, as used in the philosophy of Spinoza and elaborated by Deleuze and Guattari and Bergson, this is, we can understand them as intensities that are transmitted by objects, which buildings are one of, as a result of the way they're assembled. An affect leads to the augmentation or diminution of a body's capacities to act. It plays an important role, therefore, in determining the relationship between individuals and their environment, buildings being part of the environment. Now, a gate introduced within the perimeter wall of a building may transmit affects of closure and traversability. The asymmetric location of a window in a bedroom may transmit affect of invisibility and openness. Full height glazing of hotel rooms may transmit affect of transparency and exposure. Handrails located around museum exhibits may transmit affects of visibility and untouchability. Or skylights in a train station may transmit affects of transparency as well as protection. In this new way of working, the question of agency is therefore not what the building style represents, but in what way the affects of that building engage people in their everyday lives. Here, for instance, is the Smithsonian East Wing by I.M. Pei, where unlike on the inside of the building, where people are discouraged from touching its precious artifacts, the exterior of the museum is designed with blade-like corners, whose affects of sharpness is so inviting to touch that visitors have partly worn their edges away. Similarly, in the Guggenheim Museum, the affect of lowness of its handrails invites people to recline on it, with the result that people who might otherwise pass through its ramping galleries as if they are walking along the aisles of a supermarket, stop and lean on the handrails while they look at the art. While in the case of this cineplex, designed by my previous practice, FOA, the cluster of affects of reflectivity, glare, and deformation transmitted by its mirror stainless steel cladding means that rather than ignoring the cineplex, as is often the case with such inward-looking buildings, at a couple of points around the buildings, passers-by stop systematically and salute the building systematically, no matter what sex or age. There is no reason why people should respect this kind of building. This was certainly not part of our brief or a kind of a cultural response that we hoped to evoke. Rather like the handrails of which stop both people falling into the Guggenheim atrium and skew the conventions of its the art encounter in ramping galleries, as well as the walls of the Smithsonian that both shield the gallery from the elements, as well as free them from the protective separateness, which defines usually the gallery encounter. The envelope of the cineplex is a consequence of the practical demands for a dark interior for the cinemas, as well as the desire, in our case, to generate affects that would disrupt the traditional encounter between people and this kind of building in the city. What's going on here cannot be reduced to either the agency of the object, the building, or the passers-by subjectivities. It is produced by them through their encounter together. The traditional representational approach to style, which we discussed earlier, assumes that there is a direct road between act of looking at the building and the fact of understanding it, which we know doesn't exist. Recognizing that the aesthetic experience or encounter between buildings and people is a co-production brings us to a closer understanding of a non-anthropocentric conception of agency of buildings. That is, when different people, perhaps this is a kind of a diagram summarizing the process between people and buildings, what happens in between when the two come together. When different people with their unique subject positions come into contact with a building, they encounter some or all of its affects, which result from how its different elements have been assembled or styled. For example, a residential building may transmit affects of flexibility, transparency, or differentiation inside and privacy outside. Some people may only experience some of these as passers-by, and others may encounter all of these affects. Through these encounters, so the colors are different individuals encountering affect, which is building. So this is a building with its elements being dots, the different elements relating to each other, all together producing an assemblage, and people, depending on their perhaps relationship to the building or their individual desire, perceive the building in different ways. And through this, they create their own unique experience-based knowledge of the world. So now we can define style in this way. It is an agency, or the agency, given to elements of a building through their specific arrangement. It manifests itself as a cluster of affects that transmit directly from the building with no mediation, and this cluster of affects influences the kind of assemblage that people come to form with that building as they take part in their everyday life encounters, such as residing or working. Now, in everyday, if those ways of arranging or giving style to a building is repeated time and time again, people can become habituated to certain ways of engaging with it as if there was no other choice. Consider, for example, the interior of cinemas. When a certain way of arranging its seats are arranged over and over again in the same way, a convention emerges. The activity of watching movies in the way this seating arrangement dictates develops into a kind of naturalness, so that people begin to watch movies in this kind of cinema unthinkingly. Whereas if the convention of seating arrangement is changed or shifted, then the arrangement or the way of the style of the cinema no longer conforms to people's expectation, and even if it is just for a brief moment, a sense of surprise or possibility is opened up. But the shift I'm referring to now is not the avant-garde, like the avant-garde strategies of estrangement, which would aim to subvert or in some way disturb the relationship between people and the cinema by creating a distance between them. Rather, it is about shifting the conventions, appropriating those conventions rather than negating them, in order to produce a new state of awareness about the cinema, a process that requires the efficacy or the creative agency of the architect. Now, here is the Yokohama Port Terminal, a project that we, back at FOA, as architects, shifted a number of conventions that usually influence how people typically engage with a ferry terminal. Instead of the conventional or dominant circulation route, which is linear between the entrance of the building and the ship, that focuses really on the efficiency of handling passengers, people, between the entrance and the gates. and therefore reduces their experience to a thoroughfare. We designed it as a looped circulation system so that rather than moving simply through the cinema, they would be able to bifurcate through terminal floors, as you see here, terminal floors connecting levels above and below, and this would free them from the habit of passively passing through the terminal floors, so that they might even choose it as a place to sit down and paint. Therefore, by shifting the conventions around associated with the building for traveling, we generated a new presence or style for a ferry terminal, which loosens the building's relationship between traveling and how people would relate to it, so that they would have a more creative response towards it. Now, the philosopher Jacques Rancière, contemporary philosopher, argues that the significance of aesthetics lies in the fact that what can be apprehended by the senses determines possibilities for the participation of individuals in daily life. For Rancière, politics is a disruption or a dissensus in the conventionally perceived or prescribed spaces to make that which did not possess grounds to be seen, so that active encounters replace passive participation. So we could say that by making the conventions of everyday life activities unfamiliar, architects open up possibilities for the way bodies of individuals are supposed to fit their everyday activities, and in doing so ground style in the micropolitics of everyday life. I think this is the scale in which style becomes truly significant, at the scale of the everyday. The efficacy of the architect is not about telling people the right or the wrong way to use a ferry terminal, or to watch movies, or to live in houses, or to work in offices. It doesn't have definitive outcomes because it's actually not all within our area of control. It resides in creating a dissensus, or in how buildings are conventionally perceived, to generate the kind of differences in buildings that call for a response or active participation from the people who use them, contradicting the idea that only human subjects have agency. So architects can give this kind of agency to buildings through the way they style them. Now, to adopt this kind of approach to style, it is therefore necessary not to address it, to question it as a means of representation of external narratives, representing ourselves as architects, representing the city we work in, representing the time that we practice in, but rather as a kind of performance. So what is the consequence of this on the process of design? And this is why I thought I could use several different kinds of projects to illustrate it, so to also show that this way of working is independent of the scale of a project. It is independent of the kind of type of project, or in fact where it is. So I will be sharing with you a block of flats or residential complex in Montpellier, a boutique, which is fully an interior project, an office building, and a museum. Now, so this is the first, a building that we are now working on, a residential building in Montpellier, in the south of France, where we focused the arrangement of its elements, or I would say style, on taking the building away from the claustrophobic affects of stacking and slotting into a uniform whole, which is how residential buildings are generally arranged at, in order to provide residents with a sense of agency and ownership over their spaces. Now, in a multi-story residential building, the core, I will try to illustrate what are the different driving elements in each one of these building typologies, and the kind of grouping or arrangement that we have instigated as a way to give these elements agency, different kinds of agency in the building. So in a multi-story building, residential building, the core is the agent, determining the privacy or intrusion people experience on their way to their apartment as a consequence of its location and layout. You see here, for example, if it presents you with a corridor, you go past other people's door and you experience a loss of privacy. The floor plate, owing to the size and shape, are the agents determining the size and the number of units on any one floor and the number of orientation afforded by each, and therefore whether residents experience natural ventilation or stuffiness. The location of the service rises, core, and structure is the agent determining the level of flexibility or inflexibility residents experience over time as the need to reconfigure their apartment arises. You might start off by being, a young parent, your children grow, they leave you, you become a grandparent, and you may want to change your apartment. So how can the arrangement of its service rises, core, and structure allow you to do this? The relationship between the floor plate, the envelope, and the handrail is the agent determining the privacy or exposure residents experience in their balconies, which is quite important when the building is in the south of France and the weather is great most year. So you can see that to simultaneously assume different agencies, the building elements cannot be governed by a single unifying formal idea. They need to work in different ways. They must be considered as formally equal, but arranged as an assemblage so that each element, by virtue of its location and grouping with other elements, generates different kinds of emergent properties, different affects, whose effectivity in providing people with is about providing them with a new way of residing in the communal building. So this is a kind of a diagram suggesting the grouping of the various elements in the building. The core and service rises are centrally located in our case, coupled with the structural walls, which are red here along the perimeter. This generates an interior which is free from structure and is therefore very flexible. The external envelope is set in, so you see it produces balconies all the way around, and owing to the small size of the floor plate, it is subdivided into 4 units only, which are corner, which benefit from cross ventilation so that we avoid the stuffiness we discussed earlier. Since these outdoor spaces would abut each other, the balconies, it would be usual for dividing screens to be introduced, as you see here. Or since dividing screens would limit views laterally, they would not allow you to look 180 degrees out of your balcony, it might be that the shape of these balconies might be changed from straight to curved. This is what the Aqua Tower and the Marina Tower do in Chicago as a way to open up the view laterally, which rectifies this problem of blocked views, but introduces a new problem because the outdoor spaces overlook each other at the same time as looking at the views outside. Whether they are, around a circular plan or a linear plan, this does compromise the privacy of these outdoor spaces, as well as sideways, as well as downward, as you see here. You can see your neighbors directly below you. And therefore, a discordance might also exist between the size of the apartments and the layout inside. For example, we all think that at the Marina Tower, every single apartment has a unique balcony, but in fact, the larger balconies need 1.5, and again, the dividing wall is introduced. So the balcony is more a kind of a formal idea rather than a very careful calibration of the outdoor spaces and the unit configuration inside. And because the balcony is curved and the inside is rectilinear, a discordance might also exist between the inside and the outside. And what we tried to do with the Montpellier building was to encourage an indoor-outdoor living by making the relationship between inside and outside more seamless, and therefore not to think that the balcony is an attachment to the interior, but rather they are one. We have tried to somehow evolve these other projects of working with curved balconies as a way to expand your views to the outside, but then address the issues of privacy. and the lack of indoor-outdoor continuity. So what we've done is to start from the typical floor plate, take away the lateral dividing screen by pinching the floor plate. So we are, let's say, at the beginning now of where the Akko Tower and the Marina Towers are. In order to make the corner balconies more continuous with each other, so it's a single balcony rather than two around the corner, we shape the balcony and also the interior in a curved manner so that they would flow around the corner. The floor plate is then rotated relative to the envelope until it is impossible to see your neighbor. One balcony has 180-degree views of the exterior, but this view does not impinge into your neighbor. So you see the blue lines do not look into any of the balcony. And it's through this arrangement or relationship between the balcony location and the interior location, and and of course there is a whole series of considerations to do with structure that has to be taken into account. So as a result, we get this kind of balcony, which is quite large, and it has this kind of view, but it does not look into the neighbor next door. In order to reduce the views overlooking downwards, which we also looked at before, the position of the balconies are changed from one floor to another by shifting the location of the balconies from floor to floor until, as you see here, which of course means that the balconies in themselves develop different orientations on each floor, which becomes a means of also differentiating the kind of unit you can buy in the building, but it also means that the distance between one balcony and another is always 2 floors. It doubles the distance between neighbors, so that the overlooking that would normally be experienced in a building is kind of minimized here, because the balcony below is always 2 floors down. And now we can increase the overlooking even further. If you look at this image, the handrail can be quite an active agent in minimizing the privacy or the intrusion of your privacy even further. If you see here, through this handrail supports, you can see the neighbor down. Now the density, the location, the profile of the handrail support can actually increase or decrease this situation. This is something that in our case, because of the rotation of the floor plates, we find every time you see these red lines, there are areas where you can, even though it's 2 floors down, you can still see the neighbor below. And it's a condition that we tried to address further by looking at different, so these are plans of the handrail supports, different kinds of profiles, different kinds of densities, and different kinds of location, whether they are aligned, whether they are offset, would actually make a huge, let's say, a significant amount of difference. So views in and out, this is views in and out of the balcony. When you have rectangular profiles, what happens when there are 2 lines of support rather than 1? You can see the difference between that and that. It doesn't change very much. When you offset them, it does make a difference. Views in are reduced, whereas you can still see out. And then, of course, you can change the densities just where you need it. So if you remember the image I showed you before, if you densified where you can actually look below, that's when you actually activate the role of the handrail supports in minimizing the views down to the balcony below. They may seem small scale, but if you remember that there are people spend quite a lot of time in their balconies when the weather is good, actually makes a huge difference. And I think this is the kind of scale and the kind of instruments that architects have, no matter who is, what your budget is, or where you're building it. which year you're building it, or in fact, who is your client. And I think this is why style is an area that is totally under architects' area of responsibility, and I would say they are accountable for. And I think it makes a significant contribution in the kinds of experiences that we and others that we build buildings for shape. Now, as a result of this process, this set of decisions, we have a number of balcony types in the buildings, double height balconies that also change orientation around the building and are different in their own right, and single height balconies. We have this indoor-outdoor living where the interior is also implicated by the curved balcony, and therefore there is not this kind of discordance. Hopefully people will use this indoor-outdoor living, and as a result, I would say the exposure and homogeneity that normally one would experience in a typical residential complex have been transformed, or would be, to extreme privacy and diversity in the building. So the building isn't finished yet, so it is impossible to know how people would respond to this let's say, set of conditions that the apartments would give them. But I think it is inevitable that the encounter between them and this kind of building that generates or provides extreme private open spaces will prompt some kind of creative response from them. And that's, I think, as far as we can know as architects. Now, the style of museums can also call for active participation from the people who go to use them, whereas a primary concern for residential buildings may be privacy. A residential concern a primary concern for terminal buildings may be moving people from the entrance to the ship as quickly as possible. In contemporary art museums that don't have collections, it is usually flexibility of the galleries to host changing exhibitions. The white cube type of gallery has become the kind of the general or the typical response to this need for flexibility. But because of its total whiteness and disconnection from the rest of the museum, the gallery, as well as from the exterior, it means that it can exist anywhere, and it provides a kind of sense of neutrality and atemporality, acontextuality to the experience of viewing art. And this, I think, is a real question when people travel a lot and see the same exhibition often in different museums. Now, as the museum exterior is disconnected from the experience of seeing art, architects are often, they have no choice but to look for other kinds of narratives to develop an interesting experience for the exterior of the building, which means that, whether the architects articulate it themselves or whether it is critics articulating it for them, it ends up being, communicated to the public through these kinds of narratives, such as sales or spinnakers, rather than any kind of agency this building form carries vis-a-vis going to see art. Meanwhile, the rest of the museum, the space between the exterior and the galleries, which are sealed away, is devoid of any art experience, and therefore it simply needs to be spectacular, and it is often spectacular. Museums are considered special buildings, but the question is, how can we really make them significant because they are a place for art, rather than they are significant because they are spectacular anyway. Now, we were asked to design the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland, a non-collecting museum, a number of years ago, and try to address this idea, challenge this idea of a white cube, a gallery, inside, wrapped by some kind of external narrative outside. We try to make the galleries and the building somehow engage with the idea of going to see an art, going to see a contemporary art museum, no matter whether it's inside or outside. And rather than by thinking of it as a unified whole, again, like the residential building, we of course, these diagrams, by the way, are done after for really simulating the way of thinking about the project. But we try to, again, think of the different building elements as both as discrete agents, but also try to instigate how together, and not all at once, but together, could generate different kinds of experiences for people in the building. Now, there are the main elements or the main agents of the building are its envelope and the main stair, I would say. These are the primary agents, but they in themselves are, of course, made out of smaller elements, which, let's say, Darwin would call also small agencies, as participating in how people engage with the building at another scale. So, for example, the envelope has a shape. It has entrances, it has a cladding on the outside, it has a fireproof paint on the inside, it has a structure, and all of these are employed, let's say, as part of this assemblage of elements that instigate different experiences for the building. Now, the shape of the building is generated through a compact hexagonal floor that you see here, rising to a rectangular roof form at the top. And this is done so that it can occupy its triangular site as tightly as possible, leaving room for a plaza, as you see, between the green blocks and the white. And the shape was literally chosen because of this, of creating a plaza. But also to provide 5 entrances that you see indicated by the arrows all around the building rather than one, so that the entry floor can be subdivided and accessed in different ways over time or simultaneously, so that not all of the ground floor, the entry floor, is thought of as not, I should rephrase that, not just the main gallery is thought of as a flexible space and then everything else is kind of sculptural and spectacular, but that all of the museum is thought of as flexible space that can be reconfigured in different ways over time to generate different kinds of possibilities for the museum and different kind of experiences for people. So you see these are different scenarios of the entry floor suggested by the different colors and how the different entrances can actually instigate these different kinds of configurations. For example, as an example, we see this is a space on the entry floor with an entrance directly into the plaza, which is assembled with movable shelving so that by the day it hosts the museum store, and at night it converts to a performance art space. So a way to think that a space which is usually a shop can also be a gallery. So you don't have a gallery surrounded by a kind of event spaces, but rather everything is a gallery. But the galleries are, of course, very flexible and can be used for other functions too. The envelope shape is also designed to act together with these construction layers to generate surprising experiences. The exterior of the envelope is a vented rain screen system assembled with a black mirror stainless steel, pressed in the middle, as you can just about see on the right image, to create an oil can effect, and arranged diagonally across the building faces and seamlessly, so the panels are bent around the corner, avoiding a kind of a seam. So that they would simultaneously act as absorptive and reflective because of this, the quality of the mirror stainless steel. Rather than being timeless and detached from its context, the museum therefore engages with this context and turns, let's say, the reflections onto it into new imagery throughout the day and generates unexpected affects. Close-up, the cladding, this is a close-up image, transmits delay, refraction, compression, refiguration. We could call them, of course, other words. Displacement, light. So the pressed areas, when the sun hits it, they create these hoops of light on the pavement. Transience, since it changes throughout the day. Further away, the rain screen, together with the envelope shape, transmit other effects, depending on the point of view that you look at it from. From certain points, it transmits solidity and blackness. At other points, hollowness, since you see that there is one side which is all glass and you can suddenly look inside. Tinting, as if the different sides of the faces of the building are simply resting on one another. Ambiguity, as the different faces are tilted towards the sky or the ground, they catch light differently and therefore often are not the same color. So I've been told that the building looks like a crystal, but I think that the agency that we tried to give it was not really to represent any external narratives, though I'm sure that different people will look at anything and they will be reminded of all kinds of other images they've experienced before. I think the kind of agency that we tried to give the building and its elements was to be relational or dialogic rather than detached from its context through, in this case, the reflectivity of the rain screen. Now, inside, the structural metal decking of the envelope that we've just been discussing is another small agent whose agency has been activated. Now, because we've exposed the structure on the inside, it requires fireproofing in using paint, and we chose a blue color for this paint, fire-resistant paint, so that instead of a narrative determining people's relationship on between exterior and interior, the tension between the affect blue on the inside and the black on the outside would produce the experience of or entering the museum, which is not like moving between two disconnected states, because since both the black rain screen, the building retains a sense of surface tension that people do experience as they move through the building envelope from the outside to the inside or vice versa. Now, the blue fire-resistant paint performs other, let's say, functions too in people's experience. It wraps around, as you see just there, around all the spaces of the museum on the 4 floors and generates a kind of a continuity that could be a problem in a multi-story building, museum of floors being disconnected from each other. Now, the blue wraps around the main gallery too. And there it subverts the white cube that we were discussing earlier, in which art floats and has no weight. Now, at MoCA, the contrast between this blue ceiling that is found over the galleries and the white walls and the floor creates an inversion of the typical gallery interior as exterior, as if you have a kind of a sky over you. So the ceiling is dark enough for you to lose it before you start perceiving the color blue. And the space below acquires an affect of weight through its contrasting brightness with the darkest ceiling. Now, when there is no natural light coming in, the dark blue ceilings over the main galleries generates the illusion that the inside is outside, and the weight is certainly on the artwork. And here are portraits of people on the first public opening day. I think a strong feeling comes across of a kind of enhanced engagement with the art And no one can really say that people are distracted from the art because they are not in a white cube. And of course, the building has already lived for a number of years, and we know that artists have embraced the gallery, and it has functioned actually quite well, the idea of not having a totally white gallery. Now, the gallery walls are, of course, are temporary, and the museum moves them around and sometimes removes them entirely. When there are the walls there and natural light is completely blocked out, space is perhaps more passive, whereas sometimes when the walls are removed from the perimeter and natural light is allowed to come in, the blue perimeter walls are revealed, and as the natural light comes in, a kind of active engagement is then opened up between art and the space. Now, finally, MoCA's windows are another small element of its envelope assemblage and in shaping people's experience of the museum. They are arranged also diagonally, following the diagonal orientation of the metal cladding strips. In combination with the envelope shape, they generate an effect of movement and scalelessness, because they are going over the floors, not showing the position or the number of floors you have inside. On the inside, the windows are also mobilized to question the assumed incommensurability of the gallery inside and outside, interior, exterior, usually celebrated by these carefully designed windows where there is a gallery, there is an outside, and you're framing the outside from the inside, and therefore also distinguishing them from each other. The window reveals at MoCA are clad in mirror stainless steel. So this that you're seeing here in mirror is actually the window, the depth of the window, which reflects lateral, the landscape outside, the street outside, onto the depth of the window, and creates new kinds of relationships between the interior and the exterior, as of course the landscape outside changes throughout the day. It starts sparking new questions, as it reframes a reality outside in new ways. For example, what if a new Fangeri building that you just see here, which actually is over there, in reality would be facing MoCA? It would be much better than the existing car park that is right in front in reality. What if, for example, again, this is the window reveals, and that's what you're seeing frontally. What if crossings would be diagonal across the corner right in front of the museum? In Tokyo, they have this diagonal crossing, and in fact, it avoids slowing you down to cross a junction because you can cross diagonally. You don't have to cross and then cross to go to your destination. Now, the window reveals, as you see here, are therefore an act in themselves, in which the inside and the outside, rather than being presented as two separate, let's say, domains, are intertwined, and they bring an affect of temporality to the experience of viewing art in the galleries. The stair is another agent in changing the conventional museum experience. It is designed to provide access, but also to subvert the typical separation between art and non-art spaces, as well as the linearity of typical museum stairs. What appears as a single stair is in fact a double-decker stair. So the red is the open stair, and the egress stair is stacked under it, the green stair, the fire stair, the egress stair, which means that rather than having one route to climb up the museum, in fact, you have 10 open and closed ways of accessing the 4 floors of the museum. The route under, which is the enclosed route, the egress route, is also designed to be a sound gallery, since it is enclosed, and it is a vertical space linking the 4 museum floors. It is painted in yellow to dematerialize the sense of space and focus the attention on sound, generate affects of weightlessness, so that it's more about sound rather than weight, gravity. Scalelessness, you could say, because of the fact that all the surfaces are in yellow. The upper root, on the other hand, is designed to be both a way to access the museum, but also a social space. So landings are intentionally made wide so that people would stop and talk to each other. And the stair is extended above the main gallery to mark it, again, as an element in its own right, rather than only as a way to access the galleries, the top floor. It goes above the main gallery, and it allows you to look over the galleries when galleries are closed for setting up shows, which is not an experience you normally find that you are exposed to in museums. Now, we thought that it is important to also allow, of course, when I say we together with the museum, agreed that museums are both a place of production, the production of exhibitions, as well as a place of exhibiting art, and that's an experience that people should be open to experience. So, I've obviously this is let's say at the end of MoCA's process, which I think together we can see that its stair, its envelope entrances, its rain screen cladding, its interior fireproofing, they all have been somehow assembled so that they would engage with the micropolitics involved in visiting a contemporary art museum, entering it at different times, moving around it, moving over 4 floors, going to it when there is a show on, going to it when there is no show on, and how they provide people with different kinds of experiences. I think it's important to mention that I have presented a kind of a seamless process, but of course it was 6 years. And what I've just described is how finally the elements relate to each other, but I can assure you that the six-year process was anything but predictable. And what we found as being a kind of a productive way to engage with this constant unpredictability was to keep these elements not unified but open and independent, looking all the time for ways in which they would perhaps relate to amplify what they would do together, but never reducing them to a single narrative so that they are not able to engage with external changes that came along the way all the time. For example, I can just mention one of them. The outside of the building was not black mirror stainless steel until, let's say, 2/3 through the process. And it's only because during a presentation I made to one of the board members of the museum, it was gold. So imagine if one person in one of these presentations didn't react negatively towards the gold, and there is a story why it was going to be gold, and it would not have become a black mirror stainless steel, which of course is absolutely fundamental to how the museum is now. Now, at that point, we didn't say, no, we want it to be gold, and you have this, or we quit this project. We went back to the drawing table and investigated other possibilities, and I'm very happy that we came across this blue mirror stainless steel that has this kind of dynamic. And there are quite a number of these decisions that really came much further into the exercise, and that the building wouldn't be what it is had the process not been kept open to the idea of change. Now, if we had another 2 years, maybe MoCA would be different. But it let's say, froze at that point, the design process, and we have a product. But it could have changed further. And I think that this is how we can think about buildings as us being creative all the time with the process, rather than creative at the beginning and then somehow safeguarding that creativity at any expense and being close to the dynamics of the design process. Now, this is a much smaller project, the Victoria Beckham flagship store in London. It is on 3 floors. It's all interior. It's the first time we've had to work on an all interior project. Like most brands, Victoria Beckham has a very successful online shopping platform. So this project raised this question of how can the style or arrangement of its elements of the store, which is made out of a shop front, floors, stairs, display systems, generate a kind of a site-specific shopping experience, which would be different to their successful online platform. Now, shop fronts are usually arranged as display cases, which separate, often, I wouldn't say always, but often are separate from the interior. And they focus normally, the interior is focused on providing choice, transmitting this affect of choice, as in a marketplace, with display elements that are often, very beautifully designed, but they transmit this affect of permanence because they are fixed, and therefore predictability over time. So we said, what if we move away the convention of the store, away from these affects of predictability, permanence, marketplace, and focus on arranging its elements in a way that would engage people's, perception in different ways over time, like different propositions as they enter the store over time. Now, the shop front is designed as a window, partially in glass and partially in a concrete sash window with no merchandise on display, so that it would function, the shop front, together with the inside, and generate the sense of the shop less as a marketplace and more like a gallery. When customers approach this shop front, this window, I would say, the concrete part moves to one side and reveals itself as a sliding door, and provides a kind of a sense of surprise, just that moment of entering the store. The accessory wall, which here you see on the left, just behind the shop front, is designed to change the perception of this moment of entering the shop just after the door. The long shelves are designed to be retractable, so that the store can vary the amount of shelves that you see here, or to entirely move them away, so that the space would be turned into a kind of an event space. So over different visits, you would obviously experience this. The ceiling of this floor, as you can just about see here, is clad in mirror stainless steel, so that it would draw people's customers' attention to the top of the handbags, which are most often the most interesting parts. And to create a virtual doubling of the space. It's not very high, this entry floor. So people are engaged in a process of working out exactly where is the actual ceiling line. How tall is this space in actuality? And I think this is the kind of scale that you can obviously interact with people as they enter a store. Now, there are 2 staircases in concrete, linking the entry floor to the level below and above. The opening is arranged smaller than the actual stair itself, generating a partial ceiling to each stair, which, since it is clad in mirror 2, as you see here in these images, it shows everything upside down, and it provides uneven headroom, so that you actually have to work out which area you can walk through, let's say. So again, generating a mini scale of awareness at that moment. So you don't take going up the stairs simply for granted. It alters people's expectation that the stair is simply a practical element. It is too wide to be just practical. It is a room of its own, in which accessories and clothing and artworks can be displayed over time. Meanwhile, the ceiling on the upper floor, which you see on the right-hand image just about, is designed differently, as a coffered concrete ceiling, as a way to, again, draw your attention to the top floor. And here we can see, of course, a kind of an appropriation of the kind of coffered ceiling that we have seen in contemporary art galleries, except that here we've shifted it to function slightly differently in the context of a store. The coffered ceiling produces this kind of upward sense of expansion, but more importantly, and also it conceals the mechanical services, which in art galleries do, but in this case, it is also a display system. So we have a hung system of chains from the coffered ceiling that can be moved into different positions as if they are movable walls in a gallery, and entirely removed, so that, again, the top floor turns into an event space in a very short amount of time, as you see here in this image. Now, the alliance between the hanging system and the ceiling has other implications too for inside the shopping experience. I can tell you from personal experience that, visiting a store with a handbag, which women usually carry, can be quite an awkward exercise because you want to take the hanger off the rail. You have to put your bag down. You might be in a busy place. It could be quite chaotic. And so what the chain system does is to avoid all of that chaotic experience or awkward. And with one hand, while carrying your handbag, you can actually rotate the garments 360 degrees and even look at the price tag and really play with how you view the clothing without even taking the hanger off the chain, although you can if you want to. Now, to make the perception or experience of shopping even more site-specific, there is, of course, other elements in the store, such as counters, and the scale in which you can shift these is not enormous, but I think they can make a difference in making more of a site-specific, immersive experience. So here we have designed the counters as in mirror stainless steel, so that they would, in a way, float more as part of the floor, as well as the ceiling. You see here the ceiling being reflected, so that when you buy that small piece of accessory, your experience of looking at it or picking it up is inseparable from the space of the store. And to further liberate customers from a sense of predictability, there are, of course, benches in the store, which we've designed as a modular system, two triangles that can combine in different ways to provide the possibility of seating in larger groups or smaller, and they can be moved around very easily through the store. So when you come into the store, something that you have taken for granted, the usual displays and focus on choice of objects, starts to lose its ground. You have to find what the shop is and how you behave in it. And this is, I think, how one can make a shop more site-specific, or we could say how the style of a shop can engage with the experience of shopping. Now, let's look at an office building. This is a project that is still under development, so we haven't worked with all of its elements. It is in London. It is in the area of in what is called the cluster of tall buildings in London, but it's a mid-rise, 17 stories. And what is significant about this area is that there is quite a lot of let's say, movement between buildings that are generally for insurance companies, as this area, therefore this area generates or encourages a kind of an urban synergy between buildings, and so the space in between is the experience of moving around the building is significant. And therefore the way buildings relate to their immediate context. we were aware of a kind of a tendency that is that we started from the outside. I think that's important to mention, that with a tall building in the city, the first thing you need to do is to obtain planning approval, which means that you need to articulate how the building is going to sit within its context, its neighboring context, how it's going to be seen from the rest of London, etc. So starting from this exterior, most mid-rise buildings around our site are following this stepping in their massing as a way to disguise their scale from the street level. Now, this is something we questioned, because if you look at our building being this blue that you see, we are along a bending street, Fenchurch Street, which means that the building is never seen in its entirety. You only see the building in partially and only when you get close to it. And therefore, the issue of disguising its mass for us was not relevant, but what was relevant was its curtain wall, which is what you do experience when you are very close to it. Let's say the characteristic of its curtain wall. Now, glass curtain walls are usually assembled with in order to disappear, let's say, to be very transparent, and yet they are never fully transparent, because they are, except perhaps at night when the lights are on, because they have a lot of, they comprise of lots of elements, horizontal and vertical mullions, silicone joints, expansion joints, maybe shading devices that are usually darker than glass. And as you see here, they could, for example, in this case, generate a grid that is actually darker than glass, and they are visible. They give visibility to the curtain wall. By day, these glass curtain walls are supposed to, of course, are reflective. And this is usually also used as a way to integrate the building into its context. But at the same time as reflecting its context, they generate a sense of anonymity and disappearance in the building. And this is something we wanted to question. We wanted to take the building away from this idea of disappearance and anonymity and focus on generating a specific presence for the building. So especially at a time when we can work remotely, the idea that the workplace disappears I think should be questioned, and the workplace should be a place that is present and gives you experiences that you cannot experience if you were not in that physical workplace and you were working at home by yourself. So we have been developing a curtain wall that is made out of curved pieces of glass, fluted at different scales, and these scale shifts do two things. They allow us to mediate or articulate the building in its irregular footprint, but they also generate a variety of experiences of the curtain wall as people would move around it. As you see, our site has just a small part that is attached to an existing fabric, and it's exposed on quite a lot of its sides. Now, the glass panels are designed also with a structurally glazed reveal rather than mullions, so that glass would come to glass with a shadow gap, removing the appearance of frames that we saw in the earlier types of curtain wall. Now, therefore, instead of the combination of glass coming to glass, which is fluted, means that the context gets reflected and compressed in each one of these flutes and generates new imagery. So you see the context, but in a new way, not in its real, let's say, reflection. Now, to simplify the color and tonal range of reflections on the envelope, we are fritting it. We're going to frit it in black, which is a technique that painters use in the 18th and 19th century as a way to reduce the tonality of reflections and to turn from geometric to physiological optics. The black frit, as you see here, will reduce the tonality of reflections, but it will also absorb the black shadow between the glass segments so that the different reflections turn into a continuity. The tighter the fluting, of course, the finer the grain of the reflections. And this is this, let's say, articulation, fluting of the curtain wall together with the extruded shape that we have rather than the stepped shape will distinguish the building, give it a particular distinct presence that will separate it, will distinguish it against the buildings in the neighboring context, while this curtain wall gives the building a serrated edge at the top that also draws people's attention to the top of the building, which, unlike a typical curtain wall that disappears, it aims to appear in the skyline. Now, the cluster of affects of presence, multiplicity, verticality, fluting, serration, fluidity that emerge through just this simple set of elements are, of course, very different from uniformity, stepping, flatness that of the typical curtain wall. And this is how we think it will generate a kind of awareness about the building that might not otherwise exist. Now, on the interior, the structural frame of a building of our size is usually at 9-meter span. And when you're designing an office building, there are very few ingredients you have. You have the core, you have the structure, you have the curtain wall, but I think they can make a significant difference to the way finally the building is experienced. Now, at this span, as you see, the columns are very large, and there is a problem with it because office buildings of this nature need to be partitioned often, and partitioning is very difficult. We are developing this system, which is to distribute the structure at 3-meter span, coinciding with the glass flutes, so that they would disappear as if they are an interior mullion. They would also remove that problem of partitioning, so that at every these 3-meter spans, which coincides with kind of office module, etc., you could put partitions if you need to very easily. Now, on the outside, this was coming through a kind of interior use kind of consideration, but it has an implication too in the way the building is experienced. If you have the 9-meter grid, you see that the columns are very large on the outside, and when you remove them or let's say distribute them at 3 meters, the columns somehow disappear behind the divisions of the glass. And then if you think about these, let's say, mullion columns at 3-meter spacing, together with the frits that I mentioned earlier, one comes up to a particular distribution of the frits so that they would act together. They would instigate a kind of a new experience of the building, which is always approached on the oblique, because as I mentioned, the building is along a bending street. Now, on the oblique, as you see with these cones of, let's say, vision, the interior is always blocked in the areas of the gray tone because they are blocked by the column, by the depth of the column on the inside. So everything that is in between the gray cones, which is marked by the red, is the area that you would have transparency inside. So what we are doing is to have the frit be dense along the edge. This is half of a glass module, so it is completely dense in those gray cones. So you would first of all not reduce the transparency in or out, but you would also mask more or further the columns from the outside, because the frit is hiding them, or yes, they're hiding them. Now, from the inside, the advantage of the black frit is that physiologically the eye concentrates on the brighter elements, and therefore because the scale of the frit is very, very tiny and yet dense, you see straight through. Now on the outside, as you see here, the density of the frit going to complete transparent and again to dense means that it creates these vertical dark shadows. So it amplifies the shadows of the glass flutes and creates or generates an effect of verticality and scalelessness. So during the day, when there is no light on the inside, it's quite difficult to see where the floor plates are, which of course changes at night. Now the frit is graduated to the ground, where of course you need transparency for the entry floor. Now at night, there is a different condition that is at, or dynamic at play, where the glass becomes fully transparent, except the areas of dark frit, and the ceilings become really the way in which you experience an office building. Now, these are office buildings just around our site, which during the day are designed to be very unique, but at night they are all the same because they all use the same ceiling tile. So what we've been trying to do is to look at the ceiling as an active agent in the late afternoons for people who pass through by the building. And we are developing or playing with another standard ceiling system, which is baffles that equally well can hide services and works for acoustics, which are needed in an office building. But what we are trying to do is to use a number of scales to create an illusion of rhythm and movement rather than flatness to the ceiling. So this ceiling is actually flat, but because of the changes of scale of the ceiling baffles, it creates this kind of illusion. So from the exterior looking up at the building, at night the conjunction between the horizontals of the floor plates and the diagonals create a kind of a entirely new form that hopefully will disrupt the conventional experience of the building, at night. Now, we couldn't predetermine this. It's something that has evolved through the process, and of course, as I mentioned, the building is by no means fully designed. We've dealt with the curtain wall. We've dealt with a little bit about the structure inside, but the core hasn't been designed. The interior is yet to be determined, etc. But I think it shows that what might seem a very limited beginning or a limited area of control for an architect can be a fruitful ground for innovation and can be significant in the way a building is shaped, an office building is shaped in the city. Now, I don't know what I'm doing time-wise. Finish? I just thought I finished, and I am at the end of my lecture, to go back to really the style book, because I think the FMA projects were hopefully helpful in illustrating this way of working with the process, of this way of thinking of the different elements of the building as different agents in shaping people's experience. But I think there is, I showed you a slide with lots of contemporary architecture, and they all look different, and whether there is a common shared style. And this is another scale that the style book tries to let's say tackle and to understand and to clarify. And I think it's good to end with that. Of not just looking at our own work, but looking at the work of architects in relation to each other, and really say whether they are all different or whether they do share something. Are they only responses to the market, or are they frivolous, eclecticism, etc., or is there something happening underlying behind them that is of a shared nature? Now, I would like to argue, and this is the argument of the style book, that there is a shared approach between contemporary architecture, contemporary architects, but this is a shared approach to style rather than a shared style, and that is very different. So it's not a single shared style, a single style. It's a shared approach to style. Now, to illustrate this, what the style book does is to group projects. First of all, it assembles a lot of projects of different for different functions. They may appear at first not similar, but by drawing them all in the same style, making them all grayscale, taking away what you could call superficial differences, which are not insignificant, but they are not what is being, let's say, shared. Certain similarities in organization, I think, become apparent. And to highlight the fact that this approach, this shared approach to style, is bound up with the idea or question of everyday life, the buildings are categorized in different typologies. So buildings for residing, buildings for working, buildings for shopping, buildings for viewing exhibitions. They are grouped in this way in order to ask, are the similarities and differences between these projects somehow engaging with that activity that they are hosting, that everyday activity that they're hosting, and I think that is the case. This is when we start identifying some of the differences. For example, these are two residential buildings, and you can immediately see that there are some similarities in terms of corridor arrangement, access, open access corridors to apartments, and yet there are some differences. And the differences are, of course, as significant as I would say the differences that I was trying to illustrate in the FMA projects. So I would say that what contemporary architecture's approach to style is engaging with everyday activities as a source of finding conventions, or let's say appropriating conventions for arranging everyday activities from each other, whether it is appropriating from architects that are working right now, contemporary to us, or earlier in 20th century, or even earlier, not to copy them, but to create something new. So we can see that these two projects have a certain common set of attributes between them, the way they arrange access to apartments in a communal residential building. And yet, we could not say they are copying each other. They are different. They are different in what they provide you, what they give you as experience to your balcony, along your corridor access. Now, we can find that in schools, how structural perimeter walls to buildings can, again, be a convention that architects appropriate, but vary the experience of learning in these kinds of buildings. So this is the scale that I would say we could call dissensus, making something new to appear in the encounter between people and their everyday experience, whether it is experiencing learning in a building, experiencing residing in a building. This is, a building of our own, FOA Carabanchel, to the right, social housing, and left is Mies van der Rohe. These are two buildings that, if you look a little bit carefully in the style book, you will see that they have a very similar internal arrangement, but they are very different in the way they relate the balcony to the interior. They are very different to the way they relate also the windows to the interior, the views from inside and outside. And just to finish, I think what I've tried to illustrate is that the process of design, despite its complexities, dynamics, constraints, provides architects with a myriad of choices for assembling the various elements, as well as inputs from external collaborators. The architect's role, however, remains distinct, even though it works in a much more complex arena, that of assembling these elements together, which I have defined as style. It is within this process of giving style to buildings that the architect has agency to find opportunities to shifting conventions to free people from their everydayness and routine. So I would finish at this, and I'm open to questions from you.